At 5:55 in the afternoon, on the 29th of June, 1995, the south wing of the Sampoong Department Store in Seoul collapsed into its own basement. It took less than 20 seconds. 502 people died. The collapse was not an accident. It was not an earthquake or a fire or a freak structural anomaly. The building had been failing for at least 2 years, in plain sight, with cracks visible to the staff and to the customers growing wider every week. On the morning of the 29th, the chairman of the company that owned it was warned by his own engineers that the structure was about to come down. He evacuated his own office. He did not evacuate the customers. His name was Joon. He had been born in 1922, and by the 1980s, he was one of the richest men in South Korea. The country was in the middle of an economic miracle. Gangnam, the southern district of Seoul where his company built, was being transformed from rice fields into one of the most expensive square miles of real estate on earth. Joon's company was called Sampoong. It had grown rich on construction during that boom. Now, in the late 80s, the chairman wanted to do something more visible. He wanted a department store, a monument, a flagship, the Sampoong Department Store. The architect's original plan was for a 4-story office building with a single basement, in a flat slab concrete style typical of Korean commercial construction in the period. The slab system is simple. There are no beams. Columns rise from foundation to roof, and at each floor, a thick concrete slab spans between them. It is economical, it is fast to build, and it is unforgiving, because if you change anything about the column geometry, you must recalculate the entire structure. Halfway through construction, Joon changed his mind. He decided the building would not be offices, it would be a department store. His chief engineer told him this was impossible. The columns had been designed for office loads, desks, paperwork, light foot traffic. A department store would carry several times that weight in merchandise alone. Joon fired the engineer. A new engineer was found. The building proceeded. Then, before the doors had even opened, Joon made a second decision. He wanted a 5th floor. The 5th floor would house restaurants, 8 of them, mostly Korean barbecue establishments. That meant heating systems, kitchen equipment, gas lines, water tanks, and what is called, in structural engineering, a hot water underfloor heating slab. The thermal slab adds enormous dead weight to a floor. Restaurants of this style, even today, carry roughly 3 times the structural load of an office. The new engineer protested. He was overruled. Then he was fired. To accommodate the new 5th floor, the construction team did something that no competent engineer would ever sign off on. The columns that supported the new top floor were not aligned with the columns of the floors below. They sat on top of the 4th floor slab itself, transferring their load horizontally through the concrete rather than vertically down the structure. In simple terms, the top of the building was now standing on its own roof. The Sampoong Department Store opened to the public in 1989. It was an immediate success. By the early 1990s, it was processing roughly 40,000 customers a day. Joon's company became one of the most profitable retail operations in South Korea. There was, however, a problem. From very early on, customers began to report what they called popping sounds from the columns. The 5th floor, which housed the restaurants, was found to have minor floor sagging in certain areas. Staff in the basement, which contained the cold storage rooms and the air handlers, occasionally noticed concrete dust accumulating on the floor under particular columns, fine, white, and persistent, the way a wall sheds dust when something heavy is pressing on it from above. The company's response, according to court records that became public after the collapse, was to install carpet to muffle the sound and to send maintenance crews to sweep the dust away. On the roof of the south wing, the building had 3 industrial air conditioning units. Each weighed approximately 15 tons. They had been installed during the original construction, and they had been placed, with reasonable competence, directly above the strongest set of columns in the structure. In 1993, neighboring buildings began to complain about the noise. Sampoong was instructed by the local authority to relocate the units. The correct procedure for moving a 45-ton load of machinery across a roof slab is to disconnect it, lift it with a crane, and lower it onto its new position. The cost of that operation at the time would have been somewhere in the range of $40,000. Sampoong's facilities team chose instead to drag the units across the roof. 3 air conditioners, 45 tons, pulled across an unreinforced concrete slab on rollers, scraping a path approximately 10 meters long. The cracking in the 5th floor ceiling, photographed by maintenance staff in 1994, dates from that month. By the spring of 1995, the cracks were no longer hidden. Several columns on the 5th floor visibly shifted off vertical. A floor manager photographed a structural beam with a fissure wide enough to fit a finger. Customers in the cafeteria complained that their water glasses vibrated, then stopped vibrating, then vibrated again. Sampoong commissioned a private engineering firm to examine the building. The report, delivered in April of 1995, recommended the immediate evacuation of the 5th floor and the suspension of all heavy use on the 4th. The chairman, Joon, rejected the report. He commissioned a second opinion from a different firm. The second report, ordered to be milder, still concluded that the building was structurally compromised and that operations on the upper floors should cease. Joon's response, recorded in board minutes later, entered into court evidence, was that closing the upper floors would cost the company approximately $1 million in lost annual revenue. He ordered the upper floors to remain open. The cracks were not repaired. The merchandise was not moved. At around 9 o'clock in the morning of the 29th of June, employees on the 5th floor reported that the floor was visibly sloping. Plates and bowls in the restaurants would not stay still on the tables. The cracks in the ceiling had reached a width that staff described, in their statements afterwards, as the size of a man's hand. The general manager telephoned the chairman. At 10:30 in the morning, an emergency meeting was held in the executive offices, which were located on a wing of the building that structurally was independent from the south wing where the cracks were. Senior managers proposed an immediate evacuation of the customers and the closing of the store. The store, on a Thursday in summer, contained approximately 1,500 people. Joon's decision, communicated through the meeting minutes, was the following. The store would remain open. The merchandise on the 5th floor would be moved down to the basement to relieve weight. Customers would not be informed. At 17:50, with the store still operating, Joon and the senior executives left the building. At 5:55 in the afternoon, the south wing roof began to fail. The first column to fracture was on the 5th floor, directly under one of the dragged air conditioners. The load it had been carrying was not transferred to its neighbors, which were already overloaded. Within 4 seconds, 14 columns on the 5th floor failed in sequence. The 5th floor dropped onto the 4th. The 4th, designed to hold a fraction of that weight, dropped onto the 3rd. The 3rd onto the 2nd. The 2nd onto the ground floor. The ground floor onto the basement. Witnesses on the street outside heard what they described as a single sustained roar, like an approaching express train that lasted between 15 and 20 seconds, and then a silence. The south wing of the Sampoong Department Store had become a single compacted mass, approximately the height of a single story, with 502 people, mostly customers and shop staff, somewhere inside it. Rescue operations began within minutes. The Korean fire and military services worked continuously for more than 2 weeks. The final survivor, a 19-year-old shop employee named Park Sung-hyun, was extracted 17 days after the collapse, dehydrated but conscious. She later said in interviews that she had drunk her own urine and had prayed, and that she had given up at one point. The world heard her voice through a radio link the rescuers had managed to thread into the rubble. Joon was arrested and charged with criminal negligence resulting in death. He was sentenced to 10.5 years. He served 7. When he was released in 2003, journalists pursued him for a statement. He refused to give one. The collapse triggered the most significant overhaul of Korean construction law in the country's modern history. Periodic structural inspections were mandated for every building above 5 stories. The architectural engineering profession was, for the first time, given statutory authority to halt construction over the objections of a property owner. If you visit South Korea today, you will see, on the wall of every commercial building above 5 stories, a small printed sticker giving the date of the last structural inspection and the name of the engineer who signed it off. That sticker exists because of Sampoong. There is a phrase used by structural engineers when they teach this case to students. The building did not collapse because of an unknown force. It collapsed because of a known force, repeatedly ignored by people who had been informed in writing and in person, by their own employees and by paid external consultants, and who chose to wait. 502 people died waiting with them. If you want the next file from the engineering files, we will be looking at Therac 25, the radiation therapy machine that killed its operators by accident because of a single race condition in its software. We'll see you there.